as I was speaking with a colleague last night, she asked me, where's the black swan? Probably because of my title. And the black swan isn't a place, but it's that thing that keeps us awake at night. What is that low probability, high consequence event that keeps you awake at night? And that's what this talk is about. So the black swan is not a river per se, but it's an event, or the events that keep us awake at night, like the catastrophic floods, the dam failures, the F5 tornadoes, those sorts of things, solar storms, other things like that. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So how can we adapt exercise design to help us deal with catastrophic events? So these are the events that don't happen very often, but when they do happen, the consequences are severe or have the potential to be severe. And can we prepare for them? Can we train for them? Can we bring the emergency management community and the broader stakeholder community into the fold to help us understand these really rare events? So if anybody knows anything about swans, well, black ones are more rare than white ones, hence the picture on the diagram. And they're significantly more rare than white ones, in fact. Well, what I'm going to argue throughout my talk is that we need variety to cope with these events. Well, you might be thinking, of what? Well, we need variety in how we organize in the face of these really big events. We need to move beyond the command and control approach that we're used to when we deal with flood management to include other ways of organizing. And Naid Nenshi actually provided a nice sort of segue for this. So to help us understand this, we can go back to 1893 to Emil Durkheim. Now, I know people are starting to fall asleep. I'll be quick with Emil Durkheim, don't worry. And he argued that social life could be boiled down to two dimensions: social integration and social regulation, both from low integration to strong integration, and from low regulation to high regulation. So basically this is about integration, the way we group ourselves with other people, and regulation are the rules that we use to help us work through different systems. Now, Mary Douglas came along about 100 years later and said, well, we can actually overlap these dimensions, and this gives us 4 distinct ways of organizing. Now, she renamed them to be a little more slick and quicker to, less of a mouthful than integration and regulation, and she simply called them group, from low group, so low amounts of collective organization, to high group, high amounts of collective organization, or grid, high grid, low grid. So lots and lots of rules or not so many rules. And this gives way to 4 distinct ways of organizing. So this is what some have called the human dynamics of culture, also known as cultural theory. And what this says is that there are these 4 distinct ways, and that people don't hold to one way in every situation, but that they may have preferences or tendencies to these different ways of organizing. So here are the ways described as figures or illustrations. In the bottom left, where we have low rules and low collective organization, we have what's called individualism. In the right side, where we have high group, lots of collective organization, but low rules or low imposition of rules on that group, we have egalitarian. So these ball and cusp diagram basically represent a ball as society and the cusp as the landscape. So on the right corner, we have a ball sitting on a perched hill. So the people who are looking at the world or organizing from this perspective think that the world is fragile. And if we shake that hill, the ball's going to fall off. On the left side, on the bottom, people who are organizing from that perspective think that we can shake this hill however much we want, and the ball's going to stay in the cup. And then at the top right, we give rise to hierarchy, high levels of collective organization, and lots and lots and lots of rules. And that is illustrated by a ball in between 2 hills. Shake the hills. As long as we create the right policies, we'll keep that ball where we want it to be. And on the top left, we have fatalism, which is nature, as Naid Nenshi mentioned this morning, is capricious. It's uncertain. It's unpredictable. We can't learn anything, so why bother try? Now, if we look at this in terms of the human dynamics of catastrophe, here are some narratives for each of these ways of organizing. So first, imagine you're living in a city, I better get my car out of the parking lot first, would be on the bottom left corner. Or on the right side, on the corner, we should work together towards common goals through consensus. And up in the top right, don't worry, we'll tell you all what to do. Trust us, we are experts. And on the top left, here we go again. So these are just kind of narratives to illustrate these different ways of organizing. Now, each way of organizing depends on the others for its viability, for it to exist. Without the others, it has nothing to organize against. Furthermore, each way of organizing and perceiving distills a certain element of experience and wisdom that are missed by the others. So there's a fifth way, and that's the observer point, the person who is able to step out of the fray and to observe these four ways of organizing and interaction. And so the narrative there would be, collectively, they had the wisdom to see it coming, but instead they were each blinded by their selective attention to particular risks. Now, I have to introduce a little bit more language here to help me through the rest of my talk. So the issues of tame problems, wicked problems, and uncomfortable knowledge. So tame problems are problems where the cause of the problem is small. The range of possible solutions is equally small. There's simple solutions that are easy to recognize. And few people, organizations, or social domains are involved, and generally they're easy to deal with. So floods are generally not tame problems. Floods are more wicked problems. These are where the range of possible causes is large. Why is it flooding? It's not just the fact that there's a lot of precipitation. There are a lot of reasons why floods happen. The range of solutions is equally large and uncertain. As many of you will know in Calgary, there are many options on the table right now. And each one of those solutions will have multiple new problems that it creates. So there's a no stopping rule. Every solution leads to a new set of problems. And then we have uncomfortable knowledge, referring back to the characteristics of wicked problems, is knowledge that does not mesh smoothly with a particular definition of the problem. So if you're presenting an idea that is counter to those who are putting forward a particular solution, and they don't like it, then that knowledge, that uncomfortable knowledge, will have to be suppressed, ignored, monster adjusted, or otherwise banished. So this brings us to June 2013. So on June 20th, 2013, I awoke at night with a thought in my mind that was a little bit disturbing, nowhere near as disturbing as what was going on in Canmore and in Calgary, or about to go on in Calgary. And I started asking some questions. Well, there's a lot of water coming downstream from Alberta, and that's all going to come into Lake Diefenbaker. And are they going to be able to get the water out of Lake Diefenbaker fast enough? That was the question. And is that dam able to withstand that amount of water? So I was asking this question. Now, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a hydrologist. But these were the questions that I was asking. And I started asking the question to some colleagues around the U of S and in Environment Canada and in the Water Survey. And they started pointing me to particular people that I could ask this question of. Well, what would happen if the worst conceivable thing happened? What would happen if that reservoir failed? And this is uncomfortable knowledge. This is not something that many people want to talk about because it really raises alarm bells, and it even makes me feel tense as I'm talking about it now. Well, a few other things happened. The flood maps for Saskatoon for that kind of an event were not publicly available. Saskatoon didn't participate in the Canadian Flood Damage Reduction Program that took place in the late 70s. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's an emergency preparedness forecaster for Environment Canada, and he said, in hushed tones I admit, he said, I think they might be planning an exercise to look at that exact problem. And we were in a squash court at the time, and I said, why are you whispering? And I thought it was something that he knew was going on, but he knew he had to kind of keep it quiet because it's such an uncomfortable thing to deal with. So he put me on to a gentleman named Ray Unero, who's the Saskatoon Emergency Measures Officer. And he was the one who had the vision to look at this event. And the reason is that he came through in hazard sciences. And in hazard sciences, generally, we try to look at the worst case scenario within reason. So maybe not a meteor impact, because there's not a lot you can do, but for a catastrophic flood like this. So he convinced a number of people, including in the municipal, provincial, and federal government, that we should have an exercise to look at this kind of an event. Because if we can do this, then we can deal with any event. So Ray, I got in touch with him, and he said, I said, you know, I've been asking some questions, and I was put on to you, and he said, well, we hope to examine that very scenario in the fall, and would you like to be involved? And I thought, well, fantastic. So he allowed me to participate in Exercise Domino as an exercise controller. So answering phones, sending emails, basically helping with the communication flows between 36 different agencies who were participating in the exercise. And I got to observe the whole process and document what was going on. So I'll share some of those results now. So Exercise Domino was a multi-hazard emergency scenario. It wasn't just looking at a catastrophic reservoir failure in a major flood, but it was also looking at, well, what would be impacted if it was an F5 tornado, or what would be impacting if it was a severe snowstorm or an ice storm or something like that. So it was designed to be a multi-hazard scenario. There are cascading consequences. That's what they wanted to examine. And they were testing some different things. They were testing their emergency plans at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. Public Safety Canada was involved. The military was involved. They were looking at multi-agency response, interoperability. Can one plan mesh with another plan? Can they test the incident command systems? And they were also, for the first time, engaging with the private sector, which is a really, really important lesson that they learned from this exercise. So I'll show this next slide very quickly. How many people here from Saskatoon? Any? Just a few. Okay, I'll show this really quickly. Okay. So that was the inundation map for Saskatoon. And what people do when they first see that map is they think, where's my house? That's the first instinct that people have. And so right away, they're kind of pulled into that individualist perspective. Where's my house? Can I protect it? Now, here's what downtown Saskatoon might look like in this kind of a scenario. The estimates that came out of the modeling that was done, I think in the 90s for this event, were up to over 20,000 cubic meters a second coming through at the peak. So this is just a massive amount of water. Parts of the railway bridge would be underwater. If you've been to Saskatoon, you know that's a tremendous amount of water. So this is a really, really significant scenario that they were examining. And the fact that they got all the agencies involved to do this was remarkable. So when we see a scenario like this, many of us hold our breath. And we think, what could I do, if anything? Well, I believe that people would approach this event based on a set of these conditioned preferences from their preferred way of organizing. So these preferences can be translated to different behavioral strategies for communication and messaging. For example, if we look at the more individualized preference, people might try to inform their allies that something's coming downstream quietly so that they can get out first. Now these are extreme cases. From the more egalitarian perspective, people are demanding information from the bottom up. We want to know, we deserve to know. Why aren't you telling us? From the hierarchical perspective, it's a top-down telling. We'll tell you what to do. And from the fatalistic perspective, it's responding silently for individual self-preservation. Now, I know this is quite a lot of theory, so I'll show some pictures and then I'll dive a little bit deeper into it. But there are elements for comparison that include the myth that people have about nature, the perceptions they have of time, the scales that they prefer, the risks that they're willing to take, the styles that they choose for handling those risks, their model of consent, their latent strategy, and their preferred decision style. So now I'll break these down onto this topology once more. So comparing the elements for each way of organizing. So here we have the illustrations, and then those are the myths of nature. So in the bottom left we have nature as benign. In the bottom right, nature as ephemeral or fragile. In the top right, we have nature as perverse and tolerant. And in the top left, we have nature as capricious. And I like to represent this as the ball falling through the landscape. rather than just simply on a flat landscape. Push the ball this way or that, nothing really matters. Or the time perspective. Short term is dominant in the bottom left. Long term dominates in the bottom right. It's truncated, long or short, in the top right. And in the top left, it's irrelevant. The ideal scale. Whatever's appropriate to the individualist perspective. Small scale is ideal to the egalitarian perspective. Large scale is preferred by the hierarchical perspective. And again, it's irrelevant. So the risks that they're most concerned about, the salient risks, the ones that are most important. For the individualized perspective, it's threats to the functioning of the market. We have to be concerned about jobs. On the right, bottom right, catastrophic, irreversible, and especially inequitable developments, where some people are going to benefit more than others. In the top right, the biggest risk is loss of the public trust to those who prefer the hierarchical way of organizing. And then in the left, life, the universe, and everything. Anyway, I think you're getting the picture. This one's quite important. In terms of consent that people are willing to accept, the individualized perspective like to take what's known as implicit consent. We assume that you have consented to what we're about to do. On the bottom right, it's direct consent. We want to have an actual voice. And in the top right, it's hypothetical consent. And in the top left, it's non-consent. There was no consent whatsoever. And then there's strategies. Preservation of the individual's freedom of contract in the bottom left. Survival of the collective in the bottom right. Secure internal structure of authority in the top right. And personal survival. So these are recognizable ways of organizing that you may have seen happen in flood events or in other kinds of organizing events where there's multiple people with different perspectives involved. So what I'd like to just quickly ask, have any of you witnessed these 4 or 5 ways of organizing during flood events? Then just a show of hands if you've seen any of them. Okay, so a few people have. Maybe not everyone. Well, I think that they're important in preparation, in response, and recovery to events, and to recognize that these ways of organizing come to the fold. And we can design exercises by knowing that these are the likely ways that people are going to organize. Now, from exercise Domino, we see these dividuals. They're not individuals because people don't stick to one way of organizing every time. So we're not looking for how a particular person organizes, but we're looking for how these ways of organizing manifest themselves in a different situation. And so in exercise Domino, in the debrief, here are some of the things that we heard. So on the bottom left, from the private sector, allocation of fuels for competing sectors was a major challenge. Nobody knew how much fuel was available in the city. Nobody knew who had the fuel. And the city didn't know how much fuel it needed to fuel its fleet of trucks and whether it would be able to commandeer other trucks. And that process for commandeering was an elephant in the room during the debrief with all the participants. On the top left, another one from the private sector, they didn't tell us whether or not we should evacuate our buildings. So the private sector was left out of that messaging, that important communication, to the point that they didn't even know whether they should evacuate their staff. They participated in their building as a tabletop exercise, and they should have been getting that messaging, but the communication didn't make its way there. A lot of, when the private sector was asking, well, if you're going to commandeer one of our petroleum trucks, how do you do that? And one of the responses from a person who is more from a hierarchical perspective was, don't worry, we'll tell you what to do. Now, from the private sector, that was kind of a sticky point. Well, we're not exactly comfortable with that, and they wanted to know, what is our role in terms of the incident command system? And the response was, well, you have a liaison role. Well, the private sector actually had 80% of the assets that were needed to respond to this event, which is significant. And in the city of Saskatoon wasn't aware of that. So that was a really good learning environment, learning opportunity. Another one that came up was this issue of mass migration. A lot of people kind of on an equal playing field here. Everybody wants to get out of harm's way. How do we move them? How do we get them out? And how do we coordinate that so that the timing is staggered throughout different parts of the city? There was comments that there'd be multiple engineering failures, including electricity, communication, natural gas. In fact, the whole province would lose part of its natural gas supply. So alternative measures of communication that would function between agencies were something that was really, really discussed quite a bit during this debrief. So when people were talking about recovery, that some people changed positions, and this is what happens in these ways of organizing. Someone might be quite heroic when it comes to response, but in recovery, as Mayor Nenshi mentioned this morning, sometimes people will start to lose faith, and saying things like, "We'll never recover from something like that. It's just not possible." Industries would leave town. Potentially, we would lose doctors who would not be able to practice, and they would go elsewhere. And so the recovery would take a really, really long time. And if you look at places around the world that have had major, major catastrophes, like in Japan or Christchurch, of two areas where I'm familiar with, that happens. You lose people, and people start to lose faith, and they drift more towards a fatalistic perspective. Now, if we can try to pull them back towards the center, so that we can observe, well, what is it that you're fatalistic about? What is it that's pushing you towards that particular way of organizing? Then we may be better off. Now, lifelines, these are your communication, your transportation, your electricity. Those were an issue for all of the ways of organizing to grapple with, and these were the ones that were a really big part of the recovery. How do we get those lifelines up and running so that we can rebuild our community? So I'll just start to summarize now. Today's hazardscape is quite different than that of our forebears. We have disasters by design. We have put things into the landscape that are waiting for one of these events to hit them. And Dennis Maletti wrote a really wonderful book called Disasters by Design, where he looked at all of the major events that happened in the United States from 1975 to 1999. And he coined this term because it was so common that features of the landscape were failing, and it could have been pretty obvious that they would have failed if we had only tried to look at them from a different perspective. He also noted that 99% of the policies related to natural hazard mitigation happen after a disaster, which is really unfortunate, but it's a reality. We have increased exposure. We have more vulnerable people than we used to have. There are cascading effects where one thing that's impacted will cascade like Christmas lights going out. There's interdependency, and there's massive information flows that we've never had to manage before, and that poses major challenges. So I think that the implications for emergency response training and exercise design are that we need variety. That we need variety in our communications in messaging. We need to understand each other's ways of organizing. And we need a framework for exercise design that celebrates this variety. So how can we do that? Well, I'll boil it down to two different dimensions. Accessibility, allowing everybody to access the debate and to participate, but more importantly, responsiveness, that we are willing to respond to one another, and that we are willing to understand that I understand you. That's the really important part, is that we are willing to respond to each other. And if we can do that, then we move away from a closed hegemony where one voice drowns out all the rest to make the decisions, and we move up to a more adaptive institution where each voice responds to all the other voices at the table. It takes longer, it's more expensive, but it works better. So in exercise Domino, we are going to repeat it in 2016 in Saskatoon, and I'm hoping in advance of that to be able to help by identifying the shared or divergent mental models with the participants in the exercise, how they think about this event, how these ways of organizing can be incorporated into emergency training, so egalitarian ways of organizing, more individualized ways of organizing, as well as a little bit of healthy fatalism. We want to know what the private sector can offer. What does the private sector need from the emergency operations centers? Can they have a more active role in the incident command system, given that they have such a huge amount of the assets that are needed? Can we update the inundation maps? Well, I really think it's probably time that we do so, given that we're seeing more of these types of events. And what strategies for communication are needed before, during, and post-event? And how can we involve the public? In the latest event, the only thing that the public knew was that there was an exercise going on, because it was such a high-level event that was being considered. The organizers didn't want it to get out and cause a potential panic, which I think was a good choice, especially for the first go-through of this kind of an exercise. But in the next time, I think the public ought to have a role, more of a role than last time. So here is this framework for variety. So we need early engagement, integration, co-development, and communication. Early engagement with the private sector, integration with the incident command system, co-development with community-based response plans, and then communication with the publics and the various publics. There's not just one public. And then finally, we need science, which was right in the middle there. And we need science to help with exercise design to provide a range of physical inputs that are realistic and believable and important and credible. We need to capture and incorporate diverse perspectives, and we need to facilitate empathy among stakeholders. And I hope that the social science in particular can help with that. So here's the plug. We're using social science right now to try to develop empathy among stakeholders in terms of how they think about water resources and how they make decisions around those water resources. So if any of you are interested in participating in this research, you can contact me, and I have some cards I can give you. And what we're trying to do in this project is to maximize accessibility so that anyone can participate, and to be highly responsive to those who do participate. So we're headed now in this direction of future research to identify the shared mental models, the ways of organizing, and I've already mentioned that, so I'll skip straight to acknowledgements. I want to thank very much the Saskatoon Emergency Measures Office, all the collaborators in Exercise Domino, who are 36 different agencies, the Global Institute for Water Security, and the Changing Cold Regions Network. So thank you. I'll just leave you with this great quote from Bigley and Roberts.